Good morning, I am Dr. Suraiya Shahin and today I will teach you Victorian poetry. Who are the Victorian poets? Style and techniques and characteristics of Victorian poetry. Today I will cover all these points. In the history of English literature, the period from 1837 to 1901 is known as the Victorian period. Victorian poetry is referred to the poetic works written during the reign of Queen Victoria in England. Victorian poetry is referred to the poetic works written during the reign of Queen Victoria in England from 1837 to 1901. This is Victorian is marked by Charles Darwin's evolution theory, Reformation Bill, Karl Marx's concept of socialism, the Industrial Revolution, scientific advancement, social, cultural, and changing religious beliefs. Okay, now I talk about who are the major Victorian poets. The major Victorian poets are Tennyson, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Matthew Arnold, and J.M. Hopkins. Now, I'll talk about the style and techniques of Victorian poetry. Point number one, the trend of the sonnet. Victorian poets continued the trend of the sonnet, creating their distinguished themes and style. For example, we find Elizabeth Barrett Browning writing her sonnets, and the sonnet is Sonnets from Portuguese, and Christina Rossetti's sonnet Monna Innoni Meta. Victorian poets like J.M. Hopkins brought into practice a different sort of sonnet called curtal sonnet. Hopkins invented curtal sonnet, which is a shortened version of the patriarchal sonnet. The curtal sonnet consists of 11 lines, in which the first stanza we have 6 lines and next stanza 4 lines and a half lines. That's why curtal sonnet is called 10 and a half lines, right? Now, point number 2, that is dramatic monologue. Some of the Victorian poets used dramatic monologue for their poetic form. In the dramatic monologue, there is a single speaker who addresses a silent listener by expressing out his innermost feelings and thoughts through a long poetic speech. In dramatic monologue, we find that there is a single speaker who addresses a silent listener by expressing out his innermost feelings and thoughts through a long poetic speech. The best example of dramatic monologues are Robert Browning's poem My Last Duchess, Tennyson's Ulysses, and Augusta Webster's A Castaway. Through the medium of long poetic speech, these poets exhibit the psychological state of the mind. And third is lyrical poetry. Victorian poets also wrote lyrical poetry to express personal emotions and thoughts in a musical style. For example, Tennyson, Christina Rossetti, Swinburne, and Oscar Wilde mostly wrote their poetry in lyrical form. Clear? And next is meter and rhyme. Victorian poets often experimented with new forms of meter and rhyme, cutting the boundaries of traditional poetic structure. Clear? So they developed new techniques like a strong rhythm as Hopkins used, and the unconventional rhymes schemes as Browning used in the Pied Piper of Hamelin and other. Clear? So these are styles and techniques of Victorian poetry. Now I talk about characteristics of Victorian poetry. And the first is historical impact. Emergence of the women's rights movement brought a significant change, impacting the themes and perspectives in Victorian poetry. The expansion of education took place due to the awakening of middle class people, which subsequently increased literacy rate and gave rise to a wider readership for poetry. Influence of scientific discoveries such as Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged traditional religious beliefs, which the Victorian poets illustrate in their poetry. Influence of scientific discoveries such as Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged traditional religious beliefs, which the Victorian poets illustrate in their poetry. And the next characteristic is romantic influence. Victorian poets exhibit the influence of romantic movement such as imagination, emotion, beauty and majesty of nature in their poetry. They explored the romantic ideals with a more realistic approach to poetry. Next characteristic is influence of industrialization and urbanization. Victorian period is marked by economic changes, shaping the growth of the industrialization and urbanization. So, the Victorian poetry grappled with the rapid growth of industrialization and urbanization of British society by expressing ambivalence and concern about the changes. Victorian poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her The Cry of the Children and Matthew Arnold in East London revealed the impact of these developments on the lives of people. Even William Blake, in his poem London, unveils the field, the squalor of the cities with the rapid growth of the industrialization and urbanization. So these writers, through the medium of their poetry, expose the impact of urbanization and industrialization in their poetry. And next characteristic is death and mortality. Victorian poets, through the medium of their poetry, delves into the mystery and finality of death. Since Victorian poets found themselves grappling with the realities of death and loss of life, they tried to reveal the high mortality rates and the impact of diseases prevalent at that time. By writing elegies and memorial poems, they expressed grief, pain, and trauma, searching for consolation. For example, Tennyson wrote In Memoriam, an elegy to commemorate his Cambridge friend Arthur Henry Hallam, who died at the age of 28 years. And Matthew Arnold, the great writer and poet, in his poem Thyrsis, commemorated his friend Arthur Hughes Clough, who died in 1861. So through the medium of their poetry, they expressed their grief, pain and trauma to console their heart and searched for the consolation. Next characteristic is imagery and symbols. Victorian poets largely used vivid imagery and symbols to express the deeper meanings, feelings, and emotions in their works. Victorian poets largely used vivid imagery, symbols to express the deeper meaning, feelings, emotions, and thoughts in their works. They also drew symbols and imagery from mythology and the religious books like the Bible. Clear? Next characteristic is role of love. Victorian poets wrote their poetry taking love as a major theme in their poetry. Victorian poets wrote their poetry taking love as a major theme in their poetry. Through the theme of love, they revealed the people's changing attitudes towards love, marriage, relationship, and sexuality, because at that time a new changing was taking place in British society, and that's why people's attitude was changing regarding in love, marriage, relationship, and sexuality. And the last characteristic is science and religion. Victorian era is marked by the significant changes in religious beliefs, because scientific discoveries and new philosophical ideas challenged religious faith. Poets like Matthew Arnold and Tennyson largely exposed the changing attitudes of people's religious faith. People found themselves in a state of hopeless, helpless, and aimless. They found themselves in a state of dilemma, not knowing what to do. As Matthew Arnold expressed this shaking of faith in religion and the state of dilemma when he says, wandering between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. Okay, so these are the characteristics of Victorian poetry. Thanks for today.